Today we'll be creating this interdimensional cube. You can add in different scenes within the different faces to create this magical effect. It's going to be really simple and we're going to be using Eevee and it's going to be very fast. We'll go step by step, and with that, let's actually begin step 1. In our default scene, we'll go ahead and press GZ to bring our cube up by 1 unit by typing in the number 1. That just brings it to the base of the floor. Then we'll press Shift D to duplicate it so that we can create a wireframe on this particular cube. Now we could simply use the wireframe modifier, but the problem with the wireframe modifier is that if we want to remove just these 4 wireframes, we can't do that as it creates wireframes for the entire face. And that would also remove these attaching wireframes as well. So instead of the wireframe modifier, we're going to be using geometry nodes. So we'll bring our cursor to the junction of these 2 windows, click and drag to create a new window, and then change it to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we'll zoom in, press Shift A and search for a mesh to curve node. We'll plug that in after the group input, and then we'll convert it back to a mesh by searching for a curve to mesh, and this will allow us to give it some thickness. For the profile curve, we'll press Shift A and search for a curve circle, and we're going to reduce the resolution down to something like 3 or 4, and the radius we're going to keep fairly low. Let's go with 0.05 and plug the curve into the profile curve. Now that looks great, but there are still a few issues. The first being that these are just open, so let's check fill caps, and that way they get closed off. Apart from that, it's also very smooth. I wanted to have that solid shading, so I'll press Shift A and search for a set shade smooth node, plug that in right here, and I'll uncheck shade smooth so that we get it to be shaded flat. Then I'll press Shift A and search for a set material node. I'll plug that in over here, and then I'll go to the material properties, remove the default material, and press this plus button to add in a new material. I'll call the material wireframe, and I'll select that over here. Once we're done with that, we can go ahead and add in a floor. So for the floor, we'll press Shift A and search for a mesh cylinder, and we'll go to this drop down and just increase the number of vertices from 32 to maybe 64 to make it a bit smoother. You could go even higher if you want, but I think that should be enough. And then I'll press GZ to just bring it up on the Z axis. Now I don't want it to be intersecting this cube, so I'll continue to press GZ and move it down. But the problem of doing this is that if we were to now scale it up, it's going to also scale down, so we're going to lose the position anyways. So while it's in this position, we'll go to Object, Set Origin, and we'll choose Set Origin to 3D Cursor so that the origin remains here and it scales from this point. After which we can press GZ and just bring it down to below the cube, and then press S and scale it up by maybe 10 units. Once we have it scaled up by 10 units, you should be able to zoom within the cube, and this is what we have. Now I don't want this edge to be harsh, so I'll press Ctrl A and apply the scale, and then press Tab to go into edit mode, go to edge select mode, and just select all of these edges by Shift Alt and selecting one of the edges. Once that entire edge ring is selected, you can press Ctrl B to add in a bevel and just bevel it up, and use your mouse wheel to add in a few cuts to make it nice and smooth. Then again, in object mode, go to Object and choose Set Shade Smooth, and that way we have an infinite backdrop. Now we need to give this its own material, so let's add in a new material. We'll call it background, and to actually see all of these, we'll go to our viewport shading of rendered. We'll also go to our render properties and switch on ambient occlusion, screen space reflections, as well as bloom. Then we'll select the default light and delete it by pressing X or delete. Then we'll go to our world properties and change the world background all the way to white. Now with the cylinder selected, we have the background material, and for that we'll just make it a very light bluish color just like this, and we'll increase the metallic all the way to 1, and we'll keep the roughness at 0.5 or maybe increase it as well to maybe 0.6. Once you're done with that, we can actually start off with the wireframe material. So with wireframe selected, I'm just going to make it completely metallic, and I'll drop the roughness down to maybe 0.3. Then with the actual cube selected, we do have the default material there. We'll rename the default material to holdout, and instead of a principal BSDF, we'll choose the holdout shader. That way, everything that is present behind the holdout should become completely transparent. However, we don't see it as transparent, so to enable transparency, we're going to have to go to our render properties and then go all the way down to film and choose transparent over here. Apart from that, when we actually render the animation, we can't render it with our default render settings, so we'll have to go to our output properties, change the frame rate to whatever you want. End frame, I want it to be 3 seconds long, so I'll choose 90 so that we can go from one face to the other in 3 seconds. Output folder, I'm going to just choose the folder that we saved the blend file in, and be very sure to name these correctly, otherwise they'll get overwritten. So every time you're about to render, make sure you change the name over here. So this I'm going to call as base.mp4, and because I'm saying mp4, I'm going to switch off file extension. Once I have file extension switched off, for the file format, we're going to choose FFmpeg video, and the encoding has to be changed to make sure that we get transparency. The container has to be kept at QuickTime, and the video codec has to be changed to Qt animation. Apart from having it at QuickTime and Qt animation, you have to make sure that you change this color from RGB RGB to RGB plus alpha, which is RGBA. With these settings, you should be able to render out a video that has transparency enabled as well. Remember, QuickTime with this video codec creates much larger file sizes than having MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless, but the extra size is well worth the results. Once you have all of that set, we can actually start the animation of the camera. So let's set up the camera by selecting the camera, pressing Alt-G to clear location, Alt-R to clear rotation, and then RX90 to rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees. Now you can't see it because it's behind the holdout, so just press GY to move it back on the y-axis till it's inside your view, and then press GZ to bring it up, and press 0 on your numpad to go into the camera view. Now you can continue to press GY and bring it back till you have it at a location that you think is nice, and you can always press GZ to move it up a bit and RX to point it down at the cube. Make sure you position this to exactly what you want, and once you're happy with that, to control the animation, press Shift-A and search for an empty plane axis. You can scale it up a bit so that it's visible, and then just select the camera by selecting the outline, and once the camera is selected, press Shift and select the empty. Once you have those two selected, press Ctrl P and choose Set Parent to Object, and that way if you select just the empty and now rotate it, the camera follows the rotation as well. So on frame 0, you can tap I, rotation, and then on frame 90, which is your last frame, you can rotate the empty about the Z-axis by pressing RZ90, which will move it over to the next face. Now tap I, rotation, and down here, if you actually play the animation, you see it starts off slow, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down at the end again. We don't want that, so I'll press T, linear, and that way we'll get a smooth loop that'll make it seem like it's continuously repeating this motion forever, which is exactly what we want. Once you have a seamless loop, go ahead and press Render Animation. Once the animation is rendered out, you can start creating the animations for each individual scene. For that, we want this base cube to be present, but everything outside should not be present. So with this cube selected, we'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and for the new cube, we'll just remove the holdout material and add in a new material. This we'll call cube, and we'll be changing this based on the scene. Some of them I want to have metallic borders, so I'll increase the metallic and reduce the roughness. Some of them I might not require it, so I won't change those up. So this depends on each individual scene that you render. And apart from that, everything outside this should also be completely transparent. So we'll deal with that in a second. But what we need to note right now is that the animation can't just stop at frame 90. We need it to rotate through 190 to 180. So we'll go ahead and change the end to 180. And that way, the actual visible side is going to be this face over here, because it comes to the front and also goes out. So if you play the animation, this is the face that we're going to be having, but it just stops at frame 90. To make the animation continue with the empty selected, come down here, press Shift E and choose linear extrapolation, and that way the animation will continue beyond frame 90 as well, which is exactly what we want, and it looks something like this. Now we don't want this particular face to be present, so let's go to frame 90, press Tab to go into edit mode, go to face select mode by pressing this button, selecting this face and tapping X and choosing delete faces. We also don't require this holdout cube to be present at the moment. So let's just hide that holdout cube to see what we have, and this looks perfectly alright, which is good enough for what we wanted. The next thing that we have to do is make sure that everything outside this cube is invisible. So let's just unhide this holdout cube that we have, press Shift D to duplicate it. Make sure you're in object mode while you do that. Now you can hide the original holdout cube, select this new holdout cube that we created. Again, press Tab to go into edit mode. Select this front face and tap X and delete the faces. Now we'll just scale it up so that it's slightly bigger than the cube that we have, so that the inner faces are seen. Then press Tab to go into edit mode and just select these 4 edges over here. Once you have them selected, tap E to extrude them and tap enter, after which you can press S and you can scale it up to whatever size you want. Now that's great for removing these sides, but you see the problem is our camera crosses over it and we don't want that. So we'll just press GX and we'll move these back so that the camera does not cross over. The next issue is that the floor is still visible. So let's just select the floor, and instead of the background material, we'll choose the holdout material, and that way everything becomes transparent except for our cube, or at least the insides of the cube. Now, the reason why we use the geometry node editor for the wireframe is to prevent this particular issue that you can see right here. Because the holdout material is seen as black for the screen space reflections, this bottom face reflects complete black. So I don't want this wireframe to be present, but I need the wireframe to be present on the inside. So to fix that, we can just select the wireframe cube, which is cube 001. Again, you can always rename these properly. So you can call this base holdout cube. We'll rename this to wireframe cube. We'll call this as walls cube, and this will call us outer holdout cube. So with the wireframe cube selected, we'll press Tab to go into edit mode. We'll just select these 4 edges and then tap X, delete edges. With those delete it, we still have these wireframes, but we no longer have the wireframe in front, which is exactly what I wanted. So that's good enough. Now in the world properties, you can change this according to whatever scene you have, and you can add in lights just as well. Every single one of the 4 scenes that I'm going to be showing you, I've created tutorials in detail, step by step for all of them. So you can find links to those tutorials in the description. For now, I'll show you how I just copy paste assets from previous videos into these scenes. So first off, I want to create maybe a cinematic planet. So I'll go to the blend file that contains my cinematic planet. So over here, you can actually check out this tutorial for cinematic planets that's linked in the top right corner. But for now, I'll just select this particular sphere, which is the planet. I'll press Ctrl C to copy it, and then I'll go back to my interdimensional cube blend file. Then I'll press Ctrl V to paste it. Now I'll press S to scale it down, and then press GZ to bring it up till it's perfectly where I want it to be. Now, of course, I don't want the background to be this bright. So in my world properties, I'll change the background down to a very dark color, and I need this to be lit using a lamp. So I'll press Shift A and search for a light, point light, and I'll just press GZ to bring it up, GY to move it to the side, and then GX to move it in front of it. Once I have it positioned in my object data properties or my light properties, I'll increase the radius a bit as well as the power till I get something that I'm perfectly happy with. Now again, for my walls cube, I don't want the cube material to be like this at all. I'll change the base color to make it much darker. I'll increase the roughness all the way to 1, and I'll reduce specular all the way to 0. So maybe that's just good enough for this particular planet. So like this, you can make changes and you can render out multiple different frames. If rendering is taking a bit of time, instead of rendering out all 180 frames, you'll notice that towards the end, it does become completely transparent, and anything beyond, in my case, frame 173 is completely transparent. So I don't need to render from 173 onward, so I can end at frame 172 itself. Similarly, right at the start, it's completely transparent till frame 8. So I can start rendering at frame 8 itself instead of rendering right from 0. So that just saves me 16 frames of render time. And based on how many scenes you're adding in, it could save up quite a bit of time. Once you're happy with the way everything looks, make sure you go to your output properties, rename this to whatever you want. So let's say scene 1, and then press render animation. Once it's done rendering, again, just delete whatever objects you added in, delete whatever lighting was associated with that object specifically, change the colors according to your new scene that you're just about to create. You can change the background color as well. And then you can add in the next object, and again, go to your output properties, change it to maybe scene 2, and then render out that animation as well. Once you're done rendering out all 4 animations, or how many ever animations you want to render, we can start putting everything together into one single video. For that, bring your cursor up to this plus over here and choose the video editing workspace. Under video editing, make sure you choose video editing. With that, you should get this particular window, which essentially has 2 video sequencer windows, where one is set to preview and the other one is set to the sequencer. You also get a file browser so that you can choose files from here itself. However, we won't be using this too much because we can just add in strips from here, or we can press Shift A and choose movie and then choose the file. So let's start off with the base file and click add movie strip. So this is going to get added in wherever your cursor is present. So we want it to be right at the beginning. So I'll just press G and bring it over to frame 1. I also want it to start at frame 1 itself. So I'll change the start to 1 and the end to 4 times of the size of one single rotation. One single rotation was in 90 frames. So this is going to be 360. Now I can take this and just grab it over to frame 1, and that looks perfect. Now the problem is you don't see this to be transparent. So to actually see the transparency, you can go to proxy and you can switch off the strip proxies so that you actually see the transparency, and that looks perfectly all right. But this is ending right here. We need it to occur 4 times. So I'll just press Shift D and I'll bring it over to the side. And to help with aligning it, I can just switch on the snapping over here and then press G and it'll snap right there. Now again, I can press Shift and select both of these, followed by Shift D, and just move it till it snaps perfectly in place. So now I should have a looping animation of this particular scene that I had rendered out. Once you see that, yes, it is looping and you have a perfect situation, we have to start adding in videos beneath this. So we can't add anything beneath this because this is on channel 1. Let's just select all of them and press G, Y and move them to a higher channel so that we can add in videos underneath them. The first video that we need to add can be scene 1. So let's press Shift A, movie, and choose your scenes. I've already rendered out a few of these, so let's just use them. Now again, it's going to turn black, so make sure you switch off strip proxy and timecodes, and you have to align this so that it matches up properly. If this was 180 frames long, then you could simply move it by exactly half of that, which is -90. But remember, I did not render out the first few frames, and for these that I had previously rendered, I didn't render out the first 18 frames and the last 18 frames. So I'm actually going to have to move this to 90 minus 18, which is minus 72 units, or essentially it has to be exactly midway between this. If I press G, you can see that it's starting at minus 72 and it's ending at plus 72, which means it's perfectly midway. So everything will perfectly line up. If you play the animation, you'll see that it perfectly lines up with this scene. If you were to have it slightly off, you'll see that it won't line up perfectly and you'll have awkward transparencies and things like that, which obviously is not what you want. So make sure that you have it placed perfectly and everything will line up. Now, once you have that placed, again, press Shift A, movie, and choose your next scene. And this one again, you can plug it in exactly at frame 1 if you rendered out the entire 90 frames. If you didn't, just move it by the number of frames that you skipped. So I'm going to press G18 and that should line up perfectly with the other video, and that's how it looks. Now again, you can add in the other two scenes as well. So press Shift A and add them in. Line it up perfectly with this particular video. But again, if you skipped a few frames, just press G and move it by that many frames. And over here, you see that you're not able to see anything correctly. The reason that's happening is because this one's transparency is not off, because you have to switch off strip proxy and timecode. So make sure that for all of these, you have the strip proxy switched off, and only then will it actually look proper. Once you're done with that, add in the next scene, line it up, press G18, and that's perfectly it. You still have one more side left. So you have to take this one and just press Shift D and duplicate it to the correct midpoint, which is moving it here and pressing G18. Once you have that set up, it should be a perfectly seamless loop and you should be ready to render it out. But make sure before rendering it, you change the name to the appropriate name. So we can call this final output, and then make sure you press render animation. One more thing is I still haven't saved the Blender file, but if you want to use this /, you have to make sure that your blend file is saved, only then will it work. But once you're done with all of that and you render out the animation, this is what you should have. I really hope that was an interesting tutorial and you learned something useful from it. The main idea was inspired from another tutorial on YouTube. You can check that out. The link is in the description, but it's very old and cycles was used. So I wanted to see whether we can recreate the exact same thing in Eevee, and yes, we could. Every one of these scenes that were used in my video has been uploaded as tutorials on my channel, and the links are in the description, so do check them out if they interest you. I post videos every single day, so until the next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching, keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.